And I thought, so if I'm thinking just the way I normally would, whoever I am, I always am. And that was the first realization that I came to, is that the soul does not die, the spirit does not die. The body is nothing more than a piece of clothes, and it was dead. I'm Dr. Tony Cicoria. I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and I've had an interesting life and some interesting activities, one of which is I was minding my own business and got struck by lightning while on a payphone. And so this is the story of my near-death and out-of-body experience as a result of that. In August of 1994, my wife's family always had a communal birthday party because there were so many people with birthdays in that month. And so this year we chose to have a pavilion at a place called Sleepy Hollow Lake, which was in Athens, New York, just below Albany. And there were about 25 people with a bunch of kids, everything running around. And I was given the job of running the barbecue. And so the party is up on the second floor, and I'm out on the ground floor running the barbecue. And in the morning when we started, it was a beautiful day, and this place was right next to the lake. And I had my back to the lake, so I wasn't paying attention to what was happening there. And sometime mid-morning, I remembered that I hadn't talked to my mom, and she was not going to be at the party. So I decided I would get somebody to cover the barbecue, and I went to make a phone call. So I got somebody to cover me, and I walked around the front of the building, and there was a payphone attached right next to the bottom of the stairs going up to the second floor. I let it ring 5, 6, 7 times, and she did not pick up. And I was getting ready to hang up the phone, and I'm taking the phone, and I'm about like this, away from my face. And all of a sudden, I see this huge flash of light come out of the phone in this large crack. And I knew exactly what it was. It was lightning. And it hit me square in the face, and it threw me back like a rag doll. I just went flying backwards. And as I was going backwards, the strangest thing happened. All of a sudden, I had the sensation of moving forwards. And I remember standing there and thinking, I know I got hit, and I know I got thrown back, and I don't understand what just happened with the moving forward thing. It was so strange. And I was standing at the bottom of the stairs, and I looked off to my left, and that's where the phone was, and the phone was just dangling there. And my mind is just spinning. I'm like, what the hell is going on? And as I'm standing there, all of a sudden I hear my mother-in-law screaming, and she's running down the stairs right at me. And I'm thinking, oh, Jesus, this is not good. When your mother-in-law is screaming and running at you, it's not a good thing. And as she was coming down the stairs, I noticed that she's not looking at me. She's looking off to her left. And she got down right in front of me, and it was like I didn't exist. And she took off to her left, and I said, well, I'm going to follow her. So I took about 3 steps, and all of a sudden I was confronted with my body on the ground. And I remember thinking, oh shit, I'm dead. And it was a shock. no pun intended. But I was like, I guess I always thought, when you died, there would be something, bells and whistles, or you'd hear somebody say, it's all over, buddy, get your ass home. But there was nothing. And I was just absolutely confused. And so I'm standing there and I'm looking at this lifeless body on the ground. And there was a lady who was waiting to use the phone right behind me. And turns out that she was a nurse. And, what's the probability of that happening? This place is in the middle of nowhere. And so she gets down to start doing CPR. And I'm standing there, I'm looking at her, I'm watching what everybody else is doing. I hear everybody screaming and carrying on. And at this point, I'm saying to myself, oh my God, I'm thinking just the way I normally would. And I thought, so if I'm thinking just the way I normally would, whoever I am, I always am. And that was the first realization that I came to, is that the soul does not die, the spirit does not die. The body is nothing more than a piece of clothes. And it was dead. And at that point, I realized that, I'm spiritually whoever I am, and I'm the same person always. And at that point, I thought, well, there's no point in standing here because this feels kind of stupid. And I decided I would walk up the stairs to see where my family was, because they were all up on the second floor. And I walked over there and I started going up the stairs. And as I started going up the stairs to about the third stair, and I'm looking down at the ground because I don't want to fall going up the stairs. And I've done that before. So as I'm watching my feet going up the stairs, suddenly I see that my legs are dissolving. And I thought, whoa, this is getting really crazy now. And so, by the time I got to the top of the stairs, I had lost all form. I was nothing but a ball of energy. And the stairs actually go off to the left at the first landing. It makes a little bit of a left turn. And I didn't bother doing that. I just went through the wall. And what was amazing is that on the other side of the wall, I came out right over my wife's head. She was sitting there painting children's faces, and I memorized who the kids were, in what order they were in. I memorized all the furniture and how it was arranged. And I don't know why I did that, but it seemed like that was an important thing for me to do. And it turned out later on that it was, because when we came to actually comparing notes, there's no way I could have known those things any other way but to have seen them. And then as I finished recording all that stuff visually, I kept continuing through the room diagonally. When I got through the roof, that's when things really got kind of crazy, because all of a sudden it was like I had just fallen into a river of pure positive energy. If you could imagine absolute love and absolute peace, and those were the only things that you could feel in this energy. And as I looked out, this energy was coming from a light source to my right. And it was a big light source. And this energy was coming out, and I was watching this energy, and actually I could see the energy itself, and it looked like a sine wave as it was kind of coursing through everything. And what I realized is that this is the God energy. This is the energy that makes up everything. And I was like, I was just absolutely dumbfounded. And I'm saying to myself, this is so powerful that you could actually measure it. And, my science brain is starting to kick in, and I'm thinking grandiose things. It's kind of stupid, but um, at that point, I look around and I see that this energy is composing everything else. And I'm so excited to be in this. And I'm thinking this is the greatest thing that could ever happen to somebody, to know that this exists without a doubt. And so the energy that I was flowing in was taking me someplace. I had no idea where, and I didn't care either. But as I'm going in this river, I see a wall, which is kind of a collage of my life. And, there were pictures on the wall. And, as you looked at each picture, it would transform into a video of what was going on at that time. And I thought, that's nice to know, but it really had nothing to do with the reality I was in at that moment. And so I was just floating along in this river of pure positive energy, thinking, I'm so happy. This is the greatest thing in the world. And all of a sudden, it was like somebody flipped a switch, and bam, I was back in my body. And I was so angry. And I remember saying to myself, no, 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 please don't make me go back. And, and just given the realization that it's not my decision, I'm suddenly back in his body, and it hurt like hell. Where it hit me in the mouth and then came out my foot, felt like somebody had stuck a hot poker in both places. And I'm laying there and I'm still unconscious, but the lady who was doing the CPR had stopped, and she was kneeling next to me. And after about 10 minutes or so, when I was able to open my eyes, I don't remember exactly how long it was, I looked at her and I wanted to say, thank you for saving my life. But the only thing that came out was, it's okay, I'm a doctor. And she just laughed and said, well, you weren't a minute ago. And I was like, oh boy, I'm just going to shut up because I'm not making any sense at all. And so I laid there, and of course the police came and the ambulance came, and I refused to be transported because I'm a physician. I know what it's going to be like going to an emergency room and sitting there for 4 hours. I didn't want to do that. And I told my family, I said, please just take me home. Let me see my own doctors. And so that's what they did. And I saw my cardiologist and my neurologist friends. And, everybody said the same thing. Well, you're lucky you're alive. And, they're going to check up on me. So, at that point, I went home, and, right away I could see that things were not quite right. I could look at you and know that I knew you. I know you very well. But damn, if I could find your name. And it was like that with diseases as well. I could tell you everything about the disease, but I couldn't think of the name, and it was locked in a drawer someplace. And the same thing with people's names. So after a week, that went away. And I thought, okay, what the hell do I do now? And so I went back to work. Everything else seemed like it was back to normal. And it was. So I went back to work. And then about 2 weeks later, I started to have a real strange thing happening. I was having an insatiable desire to hear classical piano music, which was absolutely bizarre because I was a kid of the 60s. There was no such thing as classical piano music. And so I kind of looked at that and thought, this is really strange, but it wouldn't stop. And it was haunting me. It was like, I wanted to hear classical piano music. So I finally gave in and I drove to Albany to a music store that had classical piano CDs. And when I went in there, it seemed like this CD jumped off the shelf into my hands. And it was Vladimir Ashkenazy, a famous Russian pianist, playing his favorite Chopin. And I was so taken with it. I listened to it on the way home, and then I listened to it nonstop all day long. I made my family listen to it. I made my teammates listen to it in the operating room. Everybody thought I had a few screws loose. And then very shortly after that, I realized that it was not going to be enough to hear this music. I needed to learn how to play it. But that was a problem since I didn't have a piano and I didn't know how to play. My mother had made me take piano lessons when I was 7 years old for a year, which I dutifully did under threat of life and limb. And at the end of that, I said, I'm not going to do this anymore. Baseball and fishing were too much more important to me. And so the piano died a natural death at that point. But now all of a sudden, I have to learn how to play it. And the next day, one of our babysitters comes by and says, I have to move, but I have this old upright piano. It was my father's and I love it, but I need some place to store it. Can I possibly store it at your house until next year? And I thought, this is pretty strange. 1 minute I have an epiphany that I need to learn how to play, and the next day, all of a sudden the piano appears. And so I went to a music store to buy a book to teach myself how to play. And it's this magical thinking. I had no idea what I was up against. But it didn't seem to matter. I was going to proceed and do it. And so I started trying to teach myself how to play. And then about 2 weeks after that, something really strange happens. I have a dream. And the dream was like an out-of-body experience. And I'm walking out onto a stage. And out on the very front of the stage is myself. And I'm giving a concert to this enormous concert hall. And I remembered it was so vivid that I drew pictures of the seating and of the balconies that were up there. It was crazy realistic. And I walked up behind myself, and as I'm walking toward myself, I'm listening to the music, and all of a sudden I realized that this is not somebody else's music. This is mine. And I started listening to it. And I walked up and I stood behind myself. And the ending of the piece had a loud crashing ending, and it woke me up. And I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, and it's at 3:15 in the morning. And I go out to the piano and I start plunking out notes and thinking, well, I should be able to play something of the melody of the things that I was hearing. But I had no idea. I had no idea how to write. I had no idea how to play. And I said, the hell with this, I'm going to bed. So I went back to bed and got up at 5:30 because that's what time I would always get up to go to work. And so at this point, I go on about my business. And a strange thing started to happen is that every time I went near the piano and I sat down to try to teach myself how to play, the music from the dream would start playing. And it would always be exactly the same. And it didn't care what else was going on, it was going to play. If I tried to ignore it, it would become more insistent. And in fact, I learned that I had to work on that music every day or it would haunt me. And it was like a little spoiled 2-year-old. It just, Daddy, play with me, play with me. I'm like, okay, here we go. And so that's what I did. And eventually, as I started to try to teach myself, I also bought the sheet music for the music on the CD. And I was trying to teach myself a piece of music called the Fantasy Impromptu, which is a Chopin favorite. And I could not understand how it would work because the two hands are not coordinated. They're independent in this piece. And I thought, who the hell would write a piece of music like that? And so I was trying to teach myself this piece of music. And my daughter's best friend, Jackie Cypress, was over at the house. And her mom came over and she heard me banging on the piano. And she says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I can't understand why the hands don't line up on this piece of music." And she looked at me and she said, "They're not supposed to. It's what's called a polyrhythm." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "I'm not even going to try to explain this to you. You need to get a teacher." So, she gave me the name of Sandy McCain, who was the head of the music department at Hartwick College. And I gave Sandy a call and I said, "I'm an old guy trying to learn new things. Would you consider taking me on as a student?" And she had me bring 3 pieces of music that I was trying to learn how to play, and I had to audition. And she said, "I'll take you on under one condition. You do not play this music until I tell you that you can." I said, "Deal." And so we started right at the very bottom of basics, fingering, scales, how it's supposed to work, but, what the notes mean. We started meeting 2 hours a week at 5 o'clock in the morning because that was the only time we had in common. And I always felt sorry for her family because, it's this wacky guy that's coming in their house at 5 o'clock in the morning making a lot of noise. And we started that process, and I told her about the lightning story and about the music that I heard in the dream. And by then I had learned how to play bits and pieces of it. And, but I didn't know how to write any of it. And so I would play a little piece of it and I would try to write down little notes of something to jog my memory later on. And my plan was to come back to it at some point. But she would help when if I said, "Sandy, I don't understand how this can be written," and she would say, "Well, what you're hearing is 5/4, and it's got to be in this structure." And I'm like, "Oh God, okay, um, you've already surpassed my knowledge." And I continued taking lessons, and this started in 1998 that I started doing the lessons. And then I started doing a piano camp for adults called the Sonata, which was in Bennington, Vermont. And this is something that every month a different group meets. My group was in May. So every May I would go up to Bennington, Vermont, and I started in 2002. So in 2006, I went to my usual piano camp, and the owner's sister was there, Erica. And Erica was a concert pianist, but she was also the #1 salesperson at Steinway in New York City. And we got talking about this, and And she said, she was amazed that I was playing things with my limited number of years of experience. I was playing things that people with 20 years and 30 years experience are playing. And so she thought there was really some strange aptitude that I had for music. And we finished our conversation, and she went her way and I went mine. And then a month later, I get a phone call from Dr. Oliver Sacks, who's a famous neurologist and who was the author of the book Awakenings, and was the person who discovered treatments for Parkinson's. And Dr. Sacks, as it turns out, was good friends with Erica. And Erica had called him and told him about this wacky guy in upstate New York who got hit with lightning and now all of a sudden thinks he's a musician. And so he asked me if I would come down to New York because he was collecting patients like me for a new book. And I said, sure, I'd be glad to come down. So in August of 2006, I got to spend a full day with Dr. Oliver Sacks, which was just an incredible landmark in my life. What an amazing man. And we talked all day long about, the lightning and, the out of body experience and the near death experience. And at the end of the day, we're standing there and I'm saying goodbye, and he looks at me with these piercing eyes that he had. And he says, the music from the dream went through an awful lot of trouble to get here. The least you can do is write it. And I was so taken by that. When I got home the very next day, the first thing I did was I went to a computer store, and I bought a program called Sibelius, which is like music writing for dummies. And what it is you play into a keyboard, electronic keyboard, which goes into your computer, and it will spit out whatever it is you play in. And so that was my first experience with trying to write something. And so by that time, I had been able to hear and play most of the music that was from the dream. But I needed to be able to write it so that other people could see it. And so I started this process, and I spent the next 7 months, every waking hour that I wasn't working as a surgeon, I was at the piano trying to accomplish this task. And which is unfortunate from the standpoint that I neglected my family, my wife, my kids. I was so obsessed with the music and getting it into completion. And so I finally did finish it 2 weeks before piano camp. And so I brought it to my piano camp in May of 2007. And I played it for my group because part of the ritual was that the last day, everybody had to play some piece of music that they'd been working on. And so it was a mini concert. And that's what I did. And I played it using the music, and it was well received. And before I left, I got a phone call there at the music camp from Oliver Sacks. And Oliver said, I want to use your story in my book. And I said, I don't have anything to hide. You're welcome to use it. And he said, good, because you're chapter 1, and it's going to be in the New Yorker magazine July 23rd. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Time out. I wasn't quite ready for that. And he says, it'll be fine. I was like, okay. So July comes around and the New Yorker magazine comes out, and sure enough, chapter 1 is published in the magazine. And suddenly the phone is ringing off the hook. And, people who were interested. And one of the first calls I got was from Carlton Clay, who was the head of music at State University of New York in Oneonta, which is where we lived. And I've known Carlton for years. And Carlton says, I just got my magazine, and there's this big story about you. And I said, yeah, I knew that was coming. And he said, I was wondering if you would come and teach a class about it. And I thought, sure, how bad could that be? And so I agreed to teach a class. And then he calls back a week later and he goes, Jesus, you would not believe the amount of people that are calling me about this. And he says, would you play the music for the class? And I said, sure, I'll do that. And so now I've committed myself to teaching a class and playing some music. And I thought that was the end of it. And about a month goes by, and Carlton calls again. And he says, I hate to do this to you, he says, but he says, you just would not believe the amount of people that are calling. And everybody's calling me, wanting me to do something about it. And he said, would you consider doing a concert at the Performing Arts Center? And I said, no, absolutely not. I don't have any idea how to do that. And he says, somehow he talks me into it. I don't know what the hell he said or why I caved in, but the next thing you know, I've committed myself to doing this. And I decided I would do it on my birthday, January 29th of 2008, kind of a rebirth, if you will. And so the next thing I did after I finished talking to him was I called Sandy McCain and I said, Sandy, I've really got myself in a bind. I said, Carlton, who she knew, Carlton wants me to do a concert at the Performing Arts Center. And I agreed to it. I said, but I don't have the faintest idea how to prepare for something like that. And I said, would you mentor me through this mess and get me ready to do it? And she says, yeah, I can do that. She says, you have to commit 3 hours a day to me. And I said, oh my God, you're kidding. She said, no. She says, it'll take every bit of it. And I'm like, okay. So we started, and we started going up to the Performing Arts Center and working with the piano that was there. She made me learn how to walk up and walk back and do all the things that I was supposed to do. And then I had to memorize all the music, which was a huge, it's a piece of music with 3 different movements and was a lot of pages. But it wasn't negotiable. I had to do that. And she would sit up there at the very top of the auditorium and she'd go, I can't hear you. I'm like, oh, Jesus. Okay. And so we went through this process. And then I thought, we're coming down to the wire here. And it's about 3 weeks away. And all of a sudden, Carlton calls me again. And I'm like, I said, no. And he says, I haven't even told you anything yet. I said, doesn't matter. The answer is no. And he says, I got a problem. And I said, what's that? He said, I got 3 television studios that want to be there for this. I said, oh, come on, Carlton, I can't do that. My God, I'm scared to death now. And he says, it's too late. You've come too far. You got to do it. And I'm like, oh, Jesus. So I get, all of a sudden, I've got the BBC One, Granada Media, and German television are 3 separate crews that are coming for this concert. And I will never forget, I went to the green room before the concert, and I remember saying my prayers, and I said to God, I said, you've got me in this mess. I said, please don't embarrass us both and leave me out there by myself. I'm going to need every help I can get. And I went out and managed to get through it without embarrassing myself or God or anyone else. And I was very grateful for that. And it was a standing room only crowd. Place was packed. And I did 3 pieces of music that I had received all in the same way. It's like I was being downloaded music into my head, the way that Mozart used to talk about it. And so I got the music finished. I performed it, and then I had recorded it as well. And so I published the CD of the music shortly after the concert. And then the music really took on a life of its own. I was asked to play all over the country at different International Association of Near-Death Studies meetings, and it was quite an exercise. And I would go and I would talk to people, and I would play the music. And then at the big, they have a big meeting once a year, and I think it was in 2013 that I did it. And I was a keynote speaker and also played the lightning piece, which I affectionately called the Lightning Sonata. But from a musicologist standpoint, it's a fantasy in its methodological form, but it's subtitled the Lightning Sonata because you can subtitle it anything you want. There are no rules about that. So that continued and continues to today. The big things that I have taken away from this is that our spirit never dies. We are who we are always and eternally. We're here to learn. We're here to grow spiritually and with hopes of being able to rejoin the source when it's all said and done. And who knows when that is? I certainly don't. But I know that it has helped a lot of people. I have been asked by the hospitals that I work in to see people who are dying and to talk to them about what's on the other side, because there is something on the other side. I mean, this is nothing more than just another part of what we go through, and then we keep coming back and going through it again and again and again, and it's all part of of our spiritual evolution. Hopefully at some point we don't have to keep going through this, because we've earned enough points that we can go and rejoin the source and not have to keep going through this. But as it is now, I'm sure I'll be back. And who knows who I'll be when I do.